All right, welcome back everybody to the Mystic Shift. My name is Cody Rothwell and I will be your host for this video. Over the next 10 videos, I will be talking about the 10 mindset shifts that move the spiritual seeker away from religious attachment and into a deeper relationship with God. I talk about these shifts in my book, The Mystic Shift, Christianity Beyond Religion. In today's episode, I will be talking about the shift on how we see ourselves, not as sinners, but as vessels of God. Before I delve into this mindset shift, I want to review what mysticism is. And I talked about this in my last video and I gave 3 definitions. The first definition, mysticism is the experience of mystical union or direct communion with ultimate reality. Number 2, mysticism is the belief that direct knowledge of God, spiritual truth, or ultimate reality can be attained through subjective experience. And the third definition was my own that I used in the book. Mysticism, or a mystic, is anyone who connects with God directly without the need of a mediator. So if God is truly the same yesterday, today, and forever, then God can certainly speak to us as God spoke to Paul, to Moses, to the prophets, to John the Revelator. So I encourage you to have an open heart and an open mind as we journey forward. So today I'm going to be presenting 2 readings, one from the Bible and one from C.S. Lewis. And after reading from both these sources, I will give you a mystical and a historical perspective of how humanity has fallen from oneness with the earth and oneness with God, and how we can rekindle that human-divine relationship. So the first reading comes from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 4, verses 1 through 13, and this is what it says. Jesus, full of the Holy Spirit, left the Jordan and was led by the Spirit into the wilderness, where for 40 days he was tempted by the devil. He ate nothing during those days, and at the end of them he was hungry. The devil said to him, "If you are the Son of God, tell this stone to become bread." Jesus answered, "It is written, man shall not live on bread alone." The devil led him up to a high place and showed him in an instant all the kingdoms of the world. And he said to him, "I will give you all their authority and splendor. It has been given to me, and I can give it to anyone I want to. If you worship me, it will all be yours." Jesus answered, "It is written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only." The devil led him to Jerusalem and had him stand on the highest point of the temple. "If you are the Son of God," he said, "throw yourself down from here, for it is written, he will command his angels concerning you to guard you carefully. They will lift you up in their hands so that you will not strike your foot against a stone." Jesus answered, "It is said, do not put the Lord your God to the test." When the devil had finished all this tempting, he left him until an opportune time. The second reading comes from C.S. Lewis's book, Mere Christianity. And this is what he says, quote, "The vice I am talking of is pride, or self-conceit, and the virtue opposite to it in Christian morals is called humility. According to Christian teachers, the essential vice, the utmost evil, is pride. Unchastity, anger, greed, drunkenness, and all that are mere flea bites in comparison. It was through pride that the devil became the devil. Pride leads to every other vice. It is the complete anti-God state of mind. Pride gets no pleasure out of having something, only out of having more of it than the next man. We say that people are proud of being rich, or clever, or good-looking, but they are not. They are proud of being richer, cleverer, or better-looking than others. If everyone else became equally rich, or clever, or good-looking, there would be nothing to be proud about. It is the comparison that makes you proud, the pleasure of being above the rest. Once the element of competition has gone, pride has gone." So you may be familiar with the biblical story of the creation of the world in Genesis 1, the creation of man in Genesis 1 and 2, and the fall of man in Genesis 3. Now, strangely, many Christians today begin their theology on Genesis 3, and from this theology comes this doctrine of original sin. The doctrine of original sin was established in the Christian church in the 4th and 5th centuries. Augustine was the first one to coin the term original sin. It was at the councils of Carthage between 411 and 418, and Orange in 529, that Augustine's perspective of original sin was accepted by the Roman Church. Now, a couple things to note here. First of all, Judaism does not adhere to the doctrine of original sin. Even Christians had no dominant doctrine of original sin prior to the 4th century. In fact, many 1st and 2nd century Christian writings, including the Epistle of Barnabas and the Shepherd of Hermas, assumed that children were born without sin, so they were born a blank slate. The doctrine of original sin was not emphasized in the early church. It was added much, much later. Now, I wanted to give you a historical perspective of the story of the fall, from oneness with God and oneness with all. For 90% of our human history, we were hunters and gatherers, so we would wander from place to place following our food sources. We lived in small tribes that supported and looked out for one another. We were one with nature, one with each other, and one with God. We were also animistic, which means that we believed the earth was enchanted. Every animal, every plant, every mountain, every stone, every insect, everything had a soul and had significance. As humans, we helped and relied on one another. After all, it does take more than one to take down a mammoth. Human relationships were essential for survival. And then everything changed with the planting of a single seed. We learned how to farm. Therefore, we no longer had to wander following these food sources, but we actually settled in one place and we learned how to grow our food. We also domesticated animals, which made food plentiful. But it wasn't long before we started to disconnect from the earth. No longer did everything have a soul, but we soon invented gods and goddesses who were outside of us, up in the skies, who we believe caused the rain and crops to flourish. They also caused the crops to fail, and we thought this was either one, we didn't sacrifice enough, or two, we did something to irritate the gods. Fertile land was essential to maintain this lifestyle, and it wasn't long before the strongest of the tribe began to make land claims of the most fertile soils. Everybody else who didn't have these land claims had to work for those that did. The unfortunate side effects of these land claims was the rise of inequality, poverty, oppression, warfare, genocide, and disease. The world went from abundant and providing to scarce and dangerous. We went from oneness with all to suspicious of all. Our faith that we would be provided for was replaced with fear that we might not have enough. We began to see ourselves as separate from one another, separate from the earth, and separate from God. Now, seeing the story of the fall from a historical perspective, we can see the transition from one way of life to another way of life. From faith-based, relationship-driven living to fear-based, ego-driven living. Now, I'm not saying civilization is bad. A lot of good has come of it. But we can't deny the fact that human selfishness and greed has dominated much of our collective consciousness in the last 5,000 years. The eating of the forbidden fruit symbolizes this conscious shift to dualistic thinking, this us versus them mentality. We began to take what we could and accumulate out of fear that we wouldn't be provided for. And in turn, we sacrificed our unity with one another and our connection with all things. In the story of the fall, Adam and Eve got an inclination that it was more desirable to break away from this oneness. Adam and Eve had all they needed. They were provided for. They didn't need anything else. Yet, they had an inclination to be separate and recognized as distinct from all things, as we all do. They wanted to be greater than their environment. This inclination is what we can call pride. The two passages we read earlier helps us to distinguish this vice of pride. I mentioned it in my previous video that pride is the complete anti-God state of mind. All other vices, all sin, all karma, stem from pride. Pride is what leads to the fall in the first place. As it says in Proverbs 16:18, pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit before a fall. In the first reading, Jesus is tempted by the devil, who was hoping to initiate pride within his soul, as he successfully did with Adam and Eve. Now, in my book, I refer to the devil as the great egoic consciousness. Great because it's greater than any one individual, egoic because it feeds off the human ego, and consciousness because it's dynamic. Now, the three temptations. The first one, the devil tells Jesus to turn the stone into bread. This symbolizes our need to be effective, successful, impressive, relevant, and to save ourselves. The second temptation, where the devil showed him all the kingdoms of the world, this symbolizes our need for control, to be important, and to have worldly power. And the third and last temptation, where the devil had Jesus standing on the highest point of the temple. Note, this was in Jerusalem, which is the holiest of all cities. This symbolizes our need to see ourselves as saved, superior to others, and morally elite. And note, it's the only time in the Bible that the devil quotes scripture. All three temptations stem from pride, and Jesus had to battle through every one of them. Now, in the second passage, C.S. Lewis talks about pride being the complete anti-God state of mind, in which all vices stem. Pride, as he teaches, is putting oneself above and before another. Now, for 90% of our history, this was very uncommon. If one got the inclination of pride, the tribe would work to get that one individual back into unity. If the individual continued to elevate themselves over the group, they were expelled from that tribe because they were a liability for the safety of the entire group. Pride leads to the fall. It always has. Pride is always knocking on the door of our consciousness, and we must always be mindful of it if we are to be unified with Spirit. We must be very intentional about keeping this pride at bay. We must contemplate, meditate, and pray continually and identify those areas within ourselves where pride has taken hold. We must ask God to reveal what pride we have within ourselves so that we may work to remove it. And one way to do this is to reconfigure how we see ourselves. Perhaps the greatest conscious shift any spiritual seeker can make, especially Christians, is to not see oneself as a lowly sinner, but to see oneself as a vessel of God. No, you don't have to be a Christian in order to be a vessel of God. You could be a Muslim, you could be a Buddhist, you can be a Hindu, you could be an atheist. No matter your culture, no matter your political affiliation, no matter your nation, no matter your religion, you can be a vessel of God. What if instead of fearing our humanity, we began to embrace it? What would that do? What if instead of expecting ourselves to be perfect, we embraced our imperfections and our shadow sides? What if instead of perceiving that we must earn God's love, that we started to see ourselves as loved by God and united to God already? What if we stopped seeing ourselves as separate from God, separate from others, and separate from the earth? It's time to get rid of this sinner mindset, which has kept people bound in constant fear, guilt, and shame, qualities that ultimately stem from pride. It's time to rediscover our true identity as vessels of God, and to see others equally as vessels of God as well. As 11th and 12th century German mystic Hildegard of Bingen once said, "A human being is a vessel that God has built for himself and filled with his inspiration so that his works are perfected in it." Or how about this quote from Scottish priest Johns Duns Scotus? "Jesus didn't come into the world to change God's mind about us. God so loves the world. Jesus came to change the mind of humanity about God." God isn't the one who needs any changing or to be convinced. We are the ones who need to change and to be convinced. Convinced of what? Convinced that we are created in the image of God, that we are loved by God already, and that we can be used by God if we just allow ourselves to be an open vessel. So at the end of every video, I wanted to give you some questions that you can use for your personal reflections. Today I have 4 questions for you. Number 1, in what areas of my life am I prideful? Number 2, what are my strengths, skills, talents, interests, and desires that make me a unique vessel? Number 3, where do I feel called to be the greatest expression of God's love and light to the world? And number 4, am I willing to let go of the sinner mentality and rediscover my true nature as a vessel of God? I would like you to reflect on these questions in your notebook and journal. If you feel like sharing your reflections, you can comment below or send me an email at crothwell7@gmail.com. Now, at the end of every video, I will give a meditation, contemplation, or prayer practice that will take the content that we learned about today to deepen your spiritual life. In today's video, we will be focusing on the breath. The Hebrew word ruach means breath, wind, and spirit. In the Hebrew language, breath and spirit are the same. God breathed into Adam and gave him life. At our death, we breathe our last breath and give up our spirit. After this video, find time to enter your meditation, contemplation, and prayer practice. Turn on some soft meditation music, and there's plenty on YouTube. Now, if you want to do this silently, you can do that as well. Close your eyes and begin to focus merely on your breath. On every inhale and every exhale, tell yourself and visualize the following words. I am the breath of God. If your mind wanders to various thoughts, that's okay. Don't fight these thoughts. Simply let them go as they come, and then refocus on your breath. Do this for about 5 to 10 minutes. If you have a practice going for some time, you may want to up your time to 15 to 20 minutes. That's typically a good duration. But if you're just starting out, start small and build up. Thank you so much for joining me here on the Mystic Shift today. Now, if you have a prayer request or a blessing to celebrate, please write a comment below and I'll pray for you and I'll be very intentional about responding. If you have any reflections that you would like to share with me or with the community, please write those below too. I would love to read those. I hope you found this video uplifting and encouraging in your spiritual walk, and I hope that through it, you can deepen your relationship with God. Blessings to you, my friend.